Hello, my name is Hannah Hölling, and I am pleased to be presenting you with a paper titled Post-Preservation, Paik's Virtual Archive, Potentially. I owe my thanks to Sung-Young Lee, Sang-E Park, and the director of the Namjoon Paik's Art Center, Song-On Kim, for the invitation. I am thrilled to be returning to the Namjoon Paik Art Center already for the second time. My paper draws from research done for my second monograph, Paik's Virtual Archive, Time, Change and Materiality in Media Art, which was published by the University California Press in 2017. I will enhance this perspective by insights into the digital archive. Before I start, I'd like to tell you a few words about where I'm coming from. Why I teach as an associate professor in the Department of History of Art, University College London, and a research professor at Bern Academy of the Arts. My background and one of my specialisms are in conservation, and I was trained as a conservator before venturing into academia. I am interested in the mechanics of materiality and material engagement with the world, and this is what reverberates across my scholarly work. And it also explains the title of my talk. My presentation will be comprised of two parts. In the first part, I will present you with a few thoughts on the archive, its modes of existence, and our understanding of what archive as a concept and as a material space entails. In the second part, I will look into the manifold complexity of the video and film archive housed at the Namjoon Paik Art Center. I will explore the creative potential of digital archive and how our engagement with it might change our approach to the continuity of Paik's oeuvre. So, what is an archive? In common parlance, the archive is a large repository of paperwork no longer in bureaucratic circulation. And I draw on Sven Spiker's book, The Big Archive, from the MIT Press in 2008. Archives can be seen as active nexuses of unique documents that bear marks, objects, images, and inscriptions, and enable researchers to recall and revisit individual and shared memories and histories. And this is according to Charles Meriwether in his anthology, The Archive, Documents of Contemporary Art from 2006. Archives confront the impossibility of storing everything. As Eric Claytenberg argues, traditional archives are usually organized by dominant powers, able to decide what is preserved and what is excluded. And he talks about this in his article Towards a Radical Archive from 2014. In his The Archaeology of Knowledge and the Discourse on Language, Michel Foucault maintains that understanding the archive requires looking into the systems of powers that determines what is archived and why, asking who created the rules governing the archive and accessing the archive's political and material conditions. Thus, understanding the archive is key to understanding the system that rules it. Foucault further criticized the archive as a static entity containing things that were no longer part of a living culture. The archive often occupies a physical space where documents are gathered and organized, a space whose dimensions and systems of access often stagger the imagination. A space that becomes comprehensible only when destroyed, as happened, for instance, in many cases, but the municipal archive of the city of Cologne was partly damaged in 2011. The 19th century objectification of linear time and historical process prompted a shift in the purpose of archives from legal depositories to institutions for historical research that were rooted in public administration. And we read that also in Sven Spiker's. The word archive has roots in the Greek word archaion, meaning a government house, a house of archons or magistrates, and arche, or magistracy, rule or government, and those roots were the point of departure for the French philosopher Jacques Derrida's concept of the archive, put forward in his Archive Fever, a Freudian impression from 1906. Derrida saw the archive as a physical, destructible locus of records that would disclose its meaning only in the future. His view of the archive also suggests a link with archaeology and its search for foundations or a founding principle. Yet the archive is not only a physical space containing documentary materials, it is also memory, residue, and interpretation. Since Foucault and his already mentioned archaeology of knowledge, modern theories have extended the definition of the archive as a collection of records and the space that houses them to include a quasi-transcendental metaphysical space. Thus, the archive today can entail both a conceptual and a material approach to the formation of cultural memory. In his book, or in the book Archivologie, which is occupied with the theories of the archive and which has been published in German in 2003, the media theorists and art historians Knut Ebeling and Stefan Günzel speak of the two bodies of the archive, an institution and a conception, a working space and a method. Efforts to name the role of an archive as a research practice have recently produced such terms as archivology, as the title of the German book that I mentioned before, and archival sciences. According to the social cultural anthropologist Arjun Appadurai and his essay Archive and Aspiration from 2003, the archive is a site of memory, occupying a place between the physicality of the stored material, the archival body, and the spirit that animates it, the pastness, as he say, itself. Yet if the archive were synonymous with the memory, would it require a physical space? On the notion of the archive as cultural memory, we might consult, for instance, Aleida Aßmann, her essay Archive in Wandel, der Mediengeschichte. And on the notion of the archive as a locus of memory, we might look into Wolfgang Ernst, das Archiv als Gedächtnisort, the archive as a site of memory. In his anthropological view, Appadurai conceives of an archive as a deliberate social project, a work of imagination. If the archive is our cultural memory, exclusion from it must involve forgetting. So archiving could be linked with exclusion and forgetting as much as with memory, if we follow Friedrich Nietzsche's directive that we must forget in order to imagine. In fact, forgetfulness was essential to Nietzsche's philosophical project as an upholder of psychic order. He writes about this on the advantages and disadvantages of history for life from 1874. To destroy the archive would be the same as forgetting, which links us again to the archive as physical space in the Derridian sense. The archive, conceived either as a theory or a physical space, is a dynamic space of exchange and actualization. In the words of Foucault, the archive regulates and generates statements, thus highlighting the distinction between an archive and a library. The archive produces knowledge, the library stores it. Today, it is also necessary to acknowledge the archive's role in the 5 centuries of imperialism. We need to remind us of the archive's intervention in imperial knowledge production as technology that makes that intervention possible, alongside museums and the discipline of history. This view has been represented by a preeminent political theorist, Ariela Aisha Azoulay, in her book Potential History: Unlearning Imperialism from 2019. Unlearning the archives for Azoulay means to abolish the veneer of neutrality that obliterated objects and documents of their origins, original liveness and embeddedness in cultures that produce them. Here, archiving extends to the spectacle of looting and imposing violence on those individuals which became the colonialized peoples, as well as on their objects and practices that do not necessarily were meant to be kept, classified, systematized, and preserved according to Western principles and displaced from their original embedding. Today, we simply cannot sidestep those perspectives, especially in thinking about the museum archives and museums as archives. But let me present you with yet another take on the archive, which is more inclusive and more conceptual. And I will talk about the virtual and the actual archive. Written material is a privileged kind of archival information, but must an archive be purely material? As already remarked since Foucault, the conception of the archive as a quasi-transcendental metaphysical space became practiced in recent theory. To understand an archive in its fullness, in my view, we must approach the archive as both a conceptual and a material realm. Archives are more than physical repositories. They exist on other intangible, impalpable, and non-physical levels of being. This existence is not, as some claim, metaphorical, abstract, and conceptual. Rather, I suggest it is virtual and real. And I borrow those concepts from Gilles Deleuze, Bergsonism, and obviously from Henry Bergson, on which Bergsonism is based. The virtual implicit sphere of the archive is neither fully expressed nor demonstrated. It is certainly not classified. The sphere of the archive is constituted by a system of knowledge that involves tacit knowledge, that is the unexplicated knowledge of individuals, memory, skills, and competencies. It concerns information that is not fully formulated in any written instruction. The non-physical archive is linked to its tangible counterpart by the potential of the non-physical sphere to enter the tangible physical sphere in a process of explication and formulation. In Deleuzian terms, we can speak of actualization, of a passage from the virtual to the actual. Such a differentiation between archival spheres might also be found in Diana Taylor's studies of performance. Taylor posits that the archival document must be supplemented with embodied cultural practices, such as ritual, dance, and cooking, that are not commonly or formally considered knowledge, right? She writes about this in her The Archive and the Repertoire from 2003. For Taylor, the repertoire enacts embodied memory and all sorts of ephemeral, non-reproducible knowledge. My concept of the non-physical archive and Taylor's repertoire of embodied cultural practices, both unquestionably necessary for the endurance of art forms, highlight the insufficiency of the physical archive alone. Now, you may already sense where I am going with this. Artworks and the archive are mutually co-constituted. I argue that first, it is on the basis of the archive, physical and virtual, that the identity of works of art is created and sustained. In fact, artworks are actualized from such physical virtual archive. Second, the actualization of an artwork is not one directional, right? Rather, the archive is recursive, oriented toward both the past and the future. It is a dynamic source that sustains the artwork's identity. Archives harbor the identity of artworks on the basis of which new versions, variants, and instantiations of artworks come into being. In turn, those new manifestations of artworks enter the archive, right? And enrich it, serving as a future archival material for the subsequent materializations of works of art. Our engagement with the archive, therefore, becomes an active and creative presencing of artworks, contingent on various cultural attitudes and affordances of those interacting with the archive. This means that such archive is inclusive and reflective of the cultural embeddedness of subjects, objects, and discourses with which it interacts. In my long-year studies of Paik's media installations, video sculpture, and video, I observed that a realization of a multimedia installation, such as TV Garden, Arche Noah, or Zen for TV, for instance, works that, unlike traditional artifacts that endure in a virtually unchanged form through time, they materialize intermittently on the occasion of an exhibition or a test reinstallation. Those works are contingent on what the physical virtual archive holds. To actualize them is to activate them from the inscriptions in the documents, instructions and correspondence, from fragments and objects and apparatuses that are physically present in the archive. This activation would be impossible without the skill, memory, and tacit knowledge of those individuals who possess the knowledge about these works, whether secondary or first-hand, learned directly from the artist or from the object. That knowledge that comes together in putting disparate pieces together, playing back a sequence of multi-channel videos, manipulating the picture tube, and forming spatial arrangement. This is a TV Garden in the exhibition of the Namjoon Paik Art Center at the moment. And I am showing it here to you because TV Garden was one of my main studies in the volume Paik's Virtual Archive, and also because it really beautifully embodies this idea where the virtual and the physical archive come together. This work materializes on the occasion of exhibitions or displays intermittently, right? It does not exist permanently on display through time. It exists also in many collections, but it materializes on the basis of written instructions, of the testimony and evidence that Paik left, but also on the basis of tacit knowledge, skill, and competencies that Paik's technicians, people that supported him during his life in the reinstallation and installation of this work possess. So they know how the work comes together. They know how to realize the piece. They experienced the work during earlier manifestations. So they know the practice of the instantiation and the rematerialization of this work. So the work exists in the physical form, in form of TV screens, hardware, video, obviously, because this is a one-channel video, and instruction for how to put different office plans together, different numbers of them and different numbers of the screens proportionally arranged. But the work also exists in this virtual archive, and all this comes together in the moment when the work is materialized on the occasion of exhibitions. The virtual and the actual archive all come together. Another very nice example a little later, so because TV Garden is from 1974, Paik in a way borrows this motif, but I will show you slightly the evidence of this a little later. In the work Arche Noah, Noah's Ark, which was realized for the very first time in Weiss's house, the White House in Hamburg, which is the gallery, one of the early multimedia gallery in Hamburg. You see here on your left-hand side, Arche Noah realized in its first instantiation with the help of Johann Saueracker, Paik's technician in Germany, who possesses a really amazing knowledge about how those works come together. And on the right-hand side, you see Archie Noah in 1991 at the Opel factory in Karlsruhe, already after the fact that ZKM, Center for Art and Media in Karlsruhe, had acquired this work. So you see here that the arrangement of the I will come back to the slide. The arrangement of the little flags is lacking. The animals, papier-mâché animals, are arranged differently, but also small pictograms came to beautifully decorate the ark. When we look, and also what is really interesting here is that these pictograms were painted in situ, and you can see it by the splashes of the color on the monitors, on the screens, and all over the floor, and the photograph of Mount Ararat. Now, when you see this example here, Noah's Ark is exhibited on your right-hand side at the ZKM Karlsruhe in 2008. Paik, at a certain moment, and we know it from the account of Johann Sauer-Acker, decided to enhance the installation by a plant ensemble. So this is the moment where the plant ensemble from the TV garden comes to add on the ensemble of Archie Noah. And what is beautiful here is that basically how we know about this is on the basis of what I call the virtual archive, the skill, knowledge, the memory, and the sort of kind of practice of reinstallation and constant care for the work that Paik's technician exercised during the years, right? So the work might seem different, and obviously I am not making here the argument about whether it is still the same work, whether, you know, we should come back to its early instantiation, because it is in fact impossible. The site specificity of this live video, which was streamed on the screens, is obviously would be missing anyway, because it was screened in Hamburg. But here, you know, the ensemble on the right-hand side is very site-specific to, or site-sensitive to the ZKM in Karlsruhe. But what I'm arguing here is that on the basis of this physical archive, what the physical archive holds, we reinstantiate the work, and also this physical archive would not be sufficient to reinstantiate the work if we didn't know about how this work looked like, how it came together, and how it was put together over the years. Such concept of the archive, the physical and virtual, and the artwork allows us to divorce ourselves from the views of traditional conservation, in which artworks were conceived as unique objects, often in the singular medium, created by artist genius, and linked with it intentionality. To clarify, that concept assumes that an artist creates a work intentionally. The intention involved in that act is regarded as sacrosanct, and therefore, according to traditional conservation, it has to be followed by a conservation professionals during all the processes of altering and manipulating this work. Through the virtual archive, we may begin to see an artwork as a product of multiple intentions, multiple hands and minds, that is, artist assistants, producers, technicians, curators, and conservators. In other words, the archive relativizes the weight of the artist's intention, making space for the involvement of others, conservators, curators, and technicians, in the creative actualization of the work, thus making it a realm of social investment. In the second part of my presentation, I'd like to approach the heterogeneity of the archive from a different perspective, namely leaving the physical and the virtual actual aside. I'd like to look at the archive spatial geography. And I will talk here about Paik's video archive. As Paik scholar, I have been exposed to the complex, uncensored geographies of Paik's global archive, distributed among stakeholders, mentors, collaborators, and institutions across the world. To account for it would be impossible within the limits of this presentation, obviously, but in the following, and in the context of this conference, I will glimpse at Paik's video archive housed at the Namjoon Paik Art Center. Let me remark also at this point that the idea to make this stunning collection of Namjoon Paik's video at the Namjoon Paik's Art Center publicly available cannot be prized enough. What the curators provisionally name Paik's Video Study promises to become an invaluable space for the exploration of Paik's life, work, and philosophy. It is also interesting how the democratization of access to his oeuvre loops back to the idea of the art's potential for survival, the systems that could economically be transported, as Paik says, and perhaps establish a form of artwork with no gravity, but with a potential for survival. And Paik expresses these ideas in his random access information essay from 1980, which is available on Art Forum and which I really recommend everyone to read. His vision there also, encompasses ecological insights and was very much kind of forward-looking and really novel at the time, but very much reflect our current concerns with the ecological devastation, for instance, that we experience. So when we think about the video archive, what are we thinking? What kind of video constitutes this archive, right? What does it mean to archive video and present it to the audiences in an unrestricted form? Namjoon Paik Video Archive, and any video archive for that matter, confounds the idea that an archive is homogeneous, centrally organized, and accessible by a single access point. This is because first, the video works exist in the archive in many formats, versions, variations, and editions, pointing to multiple rather than singular origins of these works. Second, the presence of these video works here at the center does not preclude them from being present in collections elsewhere. In fact, we know that Paik's working method was often characterized by multiplication, creative reuse, and adaptation of the already present footage in his subsequent works. Paik's open-ended creative process allowed for modifications and interventions long after his artworks began their life, sometimes even as they began their lives as a part of museum collection. This not only suggests that an archive must be considered as a part of a larger whole, but it also points to the multiple sides in which Paik's video is present, both as archival artifacts, that is, tapes and films housed in video and media collections around the world, and as the video components in Paik's multimedia installations in museums. It's actually really interesting to think about those as archives in their own rights, the large video walls as archives, of Paik's video. For instance, his video works such as Global Groove, or the recordings from his global satellite projects, such as Good Morning, Mr. Orwell, for instance, among others, are present across his large video walls and multimedia installations. And you might remember the TV garden that I shown you just a few minutes ago. It plays back Global Groove on its screen. In his article, Video Arts Past and Present, Future Tense, the case of Namjoon Paik's satellite works for the volume Object, Event, Performance, Art, Materiality, and Continuity since the 1960s, which is edited by myself and due from BART this year, 2021. Media theorist Gregory Zinman accounts for the extended performance of Paik's satellite works as they transmute from global broadcast to monumentalized works in his multi-channel video walls and to an atomized form as museum installations and online viewing rooms. Observing Paik's video and its constantly transmuting and vagrant form, we ought to ask whether we should see these works as entirely autonomous, or are they subordinate to the satellite broadcast that gave rise to them? How does image mobility, he asks, not only through different kinds of display, but also, and to me, it is most importantly, actually, also transfers from one medium or platform to another, affect meaning? As I mentioned earlier, the fragmentation of Paik's video archive also concerns the multiple archival sites in which we might find it. Although we might think of a large video wall as a sort of archival site of Paik's video in itself, as I mentioned. This is evident in the collections of videotapes and raw video footage present in private collections of Paik longtime collaborators, for instance, Paul Garin in New York and Mark Patzfeld in Cincinnati, both of whom Paik employed in the early and mid-1980s, respectively. I have described the nature of these collaborations in my book, Paik's Virtual Archive, in the section expanded collaborations. And I interviewed Paul Garin in 2012 and Mark Patzfeld several times over the years between 2011 and 13. And obviously there are more of those video archives present out there that need our attention. Moreover, the electronic art intermix, a really wonderful collection of Paik's videos, but also less official, perhaps, digital archives such as UbuWeb or YouTube, Vimeo, offer invaluable resources for the appassionados of Paik's moving images. And I love actually the concept of the moving image here, because moving image is more than the sort of kind of moving pictorial content, electronic content of the videos, but moving image actually speaks to the image mobility, to its kind of constant transmutation and wandering between forms, formats, archives, and sites. The material variety of Paik's video archive is not constrained to the presence of multiple fragments and instances, remixes, and citations in the collections. Editions of Paik's single channel works that were or were not included in his video sculptures or installations, recordings of broadcast. The material heterogeneity is also impacted and defined by the distinct video and film formats present in the archive, among others, half-inch, 1-inch, and 2-inch tapes, 8mm and Super 8 films, Laserdisc, U-matic, VHS, Betacam, SP. So these formats are all listed by the curators and archivists of the Namjoon Paik Arts Center as formats present in Paik's video archive in the institution. So variety is really extraordinary. Paik's video art illustrates that the mobility of Paik's images goes far beyond the constraints of one singular medium, archive, or concept. Most importantly, for my focus here, it demonstrates how both film and video technology challenge the common understanding of an artwork as physical object, and how an artist might relinquish uniqueness and singularity in favor of producing many versions of a multitude of objects. At stake in the conservation and preservation of such works is the acknowledgement of the process of change and the preservation of the intrinsic fluidity of such artworks. In the remaining time of my talk, I will address how our creative engagement with archive might sustain the fluidity of works and ensure the continuation of Paik's oeuvre. Through its promise of democratic accessibility, Paik's video study, the video study that I mentioned earlier, the extract of the Paik's video archive from the Namjoon Paik Art Center. The study promises to offer an unrestricted access to Paik's digitized videos, perhaps the user's acquaintance with technology being the only barrier. The users will be able to access a variety of versions of Paik's videos, various fragments of his works and documentaries. In the vein of the virtual actual, one could imagine that the activation of Paik's video from the digital archive will allow us to create new contents based on these historical remixes and fragments and achieve unexpected results. The concept of the fragment intrigues me here. To creatively engage with a video as a material fragment or a fragment of a larger archive carries three implications. The fragment might be a piece of a whole that it gestures towards. No? It can be a singular whole with its own characteristics that is perhaps complete. It can reference to the past as something pristine or present as something ruined. It might gesture towards the future in which it positions itself to the premise of a fullness of a future work, a future that is elsewhere. In this vein, homages, commentaries, and continuities might be created on the basis of Paik's historical materials and references, versions and variants of Paik's video works present in the digital archive. The actualization of these works from the archive done creatively by employing the digital and analog research tools might bring about new imagination of what video might become in the vein of what I name a critical, experimental post-preservation. A creative critical engagement with Paik's video archive prompts us to rethink the traditional museological approaches to the care for works of art. For a considerable time, these approaches have cultivated the concepts of material preservation and truthfulness to the singular material and authentic original emergent in the effect of an intentional act, based obviously on the Western notions of preservation. As I mentioned earlier and have outlined in my book, the versatility of Paik's filmic and video media renders these traditional museological approaches obsolete. Thus, I proposed post-preservation as a different kind of engagement with the archive, which allows a creative, innovative, inclusive, and forward-looking presencing and processing of the past in general and Paik's moving image in particular. Post-preservation is conceived as an active force against the established ideas of keeping things intact and untouched. Post-preservation is a creative actualization of sorts. It is an inclusive intertwinement of discursive and physical practices contingent on the potentiality of and activity of the archive, which becomes, rather than a realm of fixation and stasis accessible only to those privileged that have been granted certain rights, a condition of possibility for this work's survival. In other words, Paik's virtual archive, potentially. Thank you very much.